Okay, let's talk about it. What are the economic consequences of a global war? Hello and welcome to another KuLAB. My name is Ku. This is our laboratory for learning. Today we're going to talk about the topic of war and the economics of war. We're going to focus specifically on oil and what will happen if the oil supply isn't available for a certain length of time. We're going to try to remain as apolitical or non-political as we can and just talk about business English. So let's take a look at this article from the Financial Times so that you understand the vocabulary, understand the ideas behind a lot of the business and economic information that'll be posted in the next few months. Let's go ahead and dive in to our next KuLAB. As always, I like to give our authors credit. So today we're looking at an article in the Financial Times by Martin Wolf. Let's take a look at our headline. The economic consequences of war with Iran. There are lasting lessons about energy resilience to be learnt from this conflict. But let's look at this idea of resilience. So to be resilient means that you can resist something or that you can overcome that adversity. So we're going to be talking about how it works and how we can become resilient and how different countries or different areas around the world have become resilient. Capital economics considers three scenarios. The first is of a short, sharp conflict lasting about 2 weeks. The estimate is of a loss of around 1.4% of global annual oil exports and a similar proportion of LNG, liquid natural gas, exports. The second is of a conflict lasting 3 months, but with limited longer-term damages to facilities. The estimate for this is a loss of 5 to 6% of world exports of crude and LNG in 2026. The third is also of a conflict lasting 3 months, but with longer-lasting damage to capacity, notably to Iran's Karg Island. The estimate here is of a loss of 8 to 9% of world exports of oil and LNG, with an impact into 2027. Oil prices could hit $150 a barrel, and prices of gas in the EU per megawatt hour could hit 120 euro. According to Capital Economics, the only comparable global supply shock to this last possibility was from the late 1970s to the mid-1980s. All right, let's break this down. Not a lot of vocabulary, but some clear concepts we want to talk about. Capital Economics is a economic modeling software. So this is, algorithmic modeling that looks at risk analysis, that looks at something and says, okay, here's what might happen. You have a lot of inputs, how long the war might last, and it can give you some modeling over several months. So they looked at three scenarios. What could happen? The first is with a short, very quick conflict. Think about the United States and Venezuela. That was over in a matter of weeks. And so if this is similar to that very short conflict, what would be the outcome? This is saying the estimate is a loss of around 1.4% of global annual oil exports and similar proportion of LNG. So global annual oil exports is just how much oil is exported, sent to other countries globally in 1 year. So annual being 1 year. So this is talking about 1.4% of all global oil exports and liquid natural gas would be lost if there's a short conflict. The second scenario is of a conflict lasting 3 months, but in that 3 months, the United States, Israel, whoever is fighting, doesn't strike large oil fields or doesn't have a huge impact on facilities. Now, as of this filming, this recording, there's already been a couple of strikes on major oil fields. So this could be on the higher end of this. But if they leave certain areas alone, specifically this idea of Karg Island, which is a major oil refinery, then we might see only about 5 to 6% of world exports in LNG into 2026. However, if there is a lot of aggressive attempts to destroy infrastructure in Iran, then we are looking at 8 to 9% of world exports. Prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz plus extensive damage to facilities could reduce oil and gas exports substantially. So we've heard a lot about this Strait of Hormuz. We've seen a lot of information about it. It's been in the news quite a bit. So this is, of course, is the strait that is run by Iran. This is a place where a lot of oil, a lot of exports have to go through this small, narrow body of water. If this becomes an issue and there is extensive damage to facility, so extensive means a lot or extreme, could reduce oil and gas exports substantially. Substantial means, again, significant amount, a lot, a very big amount. A long and destructive war would have noteworthy effects on the price level and economic activity. In poor countries, the impact could be severe. In Western countries where affordability has become a political issue, a spike in energy cost would be unpopular. What this is saying is that obviously this kind of war, this kind of having these products unavailable would affect different countries differently. So poor countries, severe. They might lose a lot of income. They might rely on these sort of exports. They might rely on this sort of trading, and that would be very big deal. Price increases, energy increase, you might not have energy available. Turning on a light or cooking could become a significant issue. And of course, that could lead to a lot of deaths for a lot of different reasons. In Western countries, it says affordability has become a political issue. Affordability is your ability to pay for something, to afford something. So this is when you're talking about how high prices have gotten. So in the United States and in Europe, they'll talk about high prices on products that rely on oil. Any product that uses this oil in its production. And so you won't be able to afford them. So affordability will become an issue. And of course, that can become a very political issue. The most disruptive scenarios could have large and prolonged effects on oil and gas prices. So here's a graph about scenarios for Brent crude oil price per barrel. So you've probably been seeing this phrase Brent crude oil price a lot. If you've been paying attention to the news, the Brent crude oil price is the general standard for pricing of oil when we look to compare it to different areas. So this is sort of like our standard oil price. Gold has the troy ounce. So there's lots of standards that different commodities or different things are measured in. Oil is measured in the Brent crude oil. So as you can see, again, 2 weeks, it'll come back down to where it is in Q4 of 2027. But if it's 3 months and there's lasting conflict or infrastructure gets destroyed, you see this huge spike all the way through Q2 of 2026, all the way through the end of 2026. If the fighting lasts for a couple of months, we're going to be looking at effects into 2027, depending on how significant the infrastructure is damaged. What are the more narrowly economic lessons from this shock? The first is that we need to reduce our vulnerability to shocks in the availability of fossil fuels. For the US, the net effect of big rises in fossil fuel prices on aggregate real incomes is modestly positive because it is a net exporter, though the distributional effects are malign. But the opposite is true for almost all other industrial countries. Their need to invest in renewables in order to reduce vulnerability is clear. Okay, so let's break this down. This has got some really good vocabulary words and it's really complex sentences. So this is what you will read in, again, classic business journals. So vulnerability is, of course, something that you're vulnerable to or something that could hurt you, or it could cause harm to you. It means you're not well protected, so you are vulnerable to something. In this case, vulnerable to shocks in the availability of fossil fuels. It goes on to say, though, for the U.S., the net effect of big rises in fossil fuel prices on aggregate real incomes is modestly positive because it is a net exporter. So this sentence is saying, for the U.S. in particular, the net effect of big rises in fossil fuel prices. If fossil fuel prices go up significantly, big rises, on aggregate real incomes is modestly positive. So aggregate real incomes is saying across the entire nation, how does that affect the incomes of all the people in the U.S.? Saying it's modestly positive because the U.S. is a net exporter. So that means for people in the U.S., in aggregate, which means considering everyone, the real incomes are positive if there are big rises in fossil fuel prices. Mostly because a lot of people in the U.S. have investments in fossil fuel companies, or they have stocks or some retirement funds that also include fossil fuel prices, so their income might go up. Again, in aggregate. The very poorest of the people, or the people who don't have the investments, will see a very significant price increase in a lot of the products that they buy. But again, in aggregate means considering the entire whole or the entire population, income will go up a little bit. Because the U.S. actually exports a lot more oil than it imports. They're a net exporter. So with places like Texas and Oklahoma, those areas that have a lot of oil, the United States actually exports quite a bit. Though the distributional effects are malign. So malign here means it's bad. You may have seen this in a word like malignant, right? If you've talked about health, something about health. So malignant is a word that is connected to the word malign. It means bad or not very positive. In this cases, though, the distributional effects are malign. So what this is saying is that where the U.S. can distribute their exports of oil will be severely affected because this war is happening in the Middle East. But the opposite is true for almost all other industrial countries. So they're saying the fact that there's big rises in fossil fuels is very difficult for a lot of other industrial countries because they import a lot of oil, they import a lot of fossil fuels, and so it would severely affect the prices of products in that country. All right, so a very interesting article about some of the effects, specifically about oil and what might happen. We looked at 3 scenarios about what will happen if this conflict goes on for a small length of time, a larger length of time. This is a special type of video. I usually like to do videos that have a little bit longer that you can come back to in a year or two and look at a business concept. But I thought since this is a significant event in world history and we haven't done any talk about the economics of war, that I might do a couple of videos about this and really help those who are struggling with business economic papers or business journals. Every other article is about something like this. So if this did help you, please hit that like and subscribe button. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you in the next KuLAB.